Hi, everyone. I'm Marissa Evangelista. I'm an MFA intern, and I will be your host for tonight's Wil Talk with Artists. Our digital discussion tonight is with the artist, Gordon Lyon. Gordon Lyon is a computer scientist who turned into a visual artist. It was at Montgomery College where he found his love and inspiration for three-dimensional art. He considers each of his sculptures to be an experiment. Additionally, his work ranges from being representational to former compositions that are derived from his imagination. Additionally, I would like to introduce the host of our show, Wil Scott. Wil is an art historian with an extensive career as a photographer, and he was also the former head of adult programs at the National Gallery of Art. He is uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between artists and the public.
Thank you, Marissa, for those introductions. And Gordon, thanks for subjecting yourself to this interrogation. And I hope thank all of you for joining tonight. We're sort of going to extremes. 2 weeks ago, Marissa was my interviewee, and of course, she's much younger than me or Gordon. And I think I also remember that the weather was very nice, and I didn't think anybody was going to join us, but they did. Today, the weather's a little more challenging, so I hope that Gordon's art and maybe the weather forcing a few people inside. And now we'll go pole to pole, from a painter to a sculptor, from a young woman to an older gentleman. So I almost slipped up there, but Gordon's not really much older than me, so I'm not going to call him anything other than an older gentleman. So let's get started. And today, let's do something a little differently than the normal way that we've approached this, which is to chat with the artist for a little bit. But I think Gordon's work is quite visually compelling, and because it's a little, I think needs a little more visual support as we have our conversation, I want to start with the first slide. We'll just jump right in.
All right, are you ready for the first image?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
Okay. This is a very recent work, of course, as you can see from the date, and it's a pretty substantial size. But there's two things that immediately struck me about it. One, I know that Gordon and I are going to have a little bit to talk about. The other, though, is a question for Gordon. Hauraki golf, or how do you pronounce that, and where is that? Does it have any special meaning?
This work has a whole number of different things that could be talked about. The Hauraki Gulf is outside Auckland, New Zealand, and it's where a lot of people sail racing sailboats. And the America's Cup a year ago, in December 2020 up through March of 2021, was conducted in the Hauraki Gulf. And those
Are you a sailor?
sailboats,
is that what attracted you to that place?
Pardon?
Are you a sailor?
No. But I love watching these particular boats because they're hydrofoil.
Yes.
They're sailing hydrofoils. The fastest speed recorded for one was 62 miles an hour. And they crashed. The American Magic entry reared up at one point while going around a corner, and then weather vaned into the wind and came crashing down and knocked about a 6 by 8 foot hole in the hull and nearly sank.
Wow.
So that it's quite exciting to watch them. And they're hard to sail. They're very hard to sail.
Yeah.
And I must have whiled away hours watching every detail.
So is it fair, Gordon, is it fair to say that this piece is inspired directly by your observation of these hydrofoil racing boats?
That's right, yes. But it's borrowed from another piece that I had done. I have a number of styles, and one of them is going off to the junk pile and taking stuff out of that and sawing it up and recasting it. working it into newer pieces. And so this one is built from an older piece, although it's got new pieces as well. But if you look, surf the web for a picture of the crash of American Magic, you'll see a large sailing boat flying through the air in roughly the same attitude.
Yeah.
And about to come to a rather miserable end.
Well, I'm glad I asked you that question. And that's certainly the kind of thing that I can, as an artist, imagine would inspire me to take photographs, and you as a sculptor to create something like this. That's really an exciting backstory to this piece. But as an art historian, and I know that you have gone to a lot of museums and taken some art history courses, because in our conversation a few days ago, that became very clear. As soon as I saw this piece, I immediately thought of the great mid-20th century American sculptor, David Smith, and his Agricola series. Are you familiar with that?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, he's one of my favorites, you know.
I can see that.
Yeah. Another one that I like, and if you like weather reports, is Alice Aycock with her storm series, I would call them. They're like huge tornadoes made out of sheet metal. And but yes, Gonzalez.
So that seems to me, Gordon, to be one of the fundamental aspects of your approach to your work, is that you're not at all hesitant about showing connectedness to some of these great names. Some artists, you know, they don't want to admit that, or maybe they're not as self-aware about what it is that's affecting them as you seem to be. But is that something you embrace, that you're consciously thinking, well, you know, David Smith did this with some metal cut and welded and shaped, and I'm going to try to riff off of some of the things that I've seen him do?
Well, I don't try to copy specific ones. It just bubbles up from somewhere. You know, if you back up to Picasso and what was it, Gonzalez?
Yeah, Gonzalez.
Gonzalez has a number of works. There's one especially of a welded hammered iron of a woman's torso, and you know, I have a lot of torsos in my work too. I'm certainly aware of them, and I'm what would you call that, neoclassical, or you know, where you keep harking back to stuff 100 years ago. I'm quite happy.
Yes, in a free use of the term. You know, as an art historian, we're hung up on vocabulary. We're kind of like the Académie Française. You know, it's got to be the right word used the right way. But you're using it in the substantively correct way. You're going back to a classic of modern sculpture, and you're not imitating, but you're being inspired or being influenced by it. And that's something that many of the artists that we've talked with, I talked with in Wil Talks, they're more intuitive and more sort of by the seat of the pants. And I mean that in a good way. They're doing what at the moment is their response to what they've seen or experienced. And I'm actually more in line with you. I can't help but think about some of the great photographers. When I do my work, I may not think about it until somebody in an audience, you know, or viewer points it out. But I want to just ask you a couple of things, and then we'll move on. The way that you have flat sheets of metal that you have cut and then bent, and particularly the attenuated wire or rod that goes up to the upper right, and then there's a little bit of what looks like part of a bicycle cog or something.
Yeah, that's right.
It is a bicycle cog?
Sure. You know, back when I was bicycling, I used to wear them out a lot. And so I had a lot of those things lying around in the junk pile, you know.
I do too. Well,
Well, there you go.
so I think that that's, it seems to me to be the basic form of those hydrofoil racers, right? And does the mass of interlinked material sort of at the base of the triangle, is that referring to the collisions that they can have, or?
Well, I'll just leave that up to the viewer. It really didn't. It had to do more with a technical reason, and that is if you look at the inset view, there's like a little crescent. You see a little red thing there?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things was I had to figure out how I was going to display this. And so the crescent has a little notch on it. And so the whole thing sort of, it's actually a mobile, although it's not very mobile. It kind of wiggles and dangles, it's suspended. That was more a technical, I didn't want it to be sitting on a base of any sort.
So it's kind of like your jib going back and forth.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a very classic piece, and I mean that in the sense of metal cut and welded sculpture. And Julio Gonzalez, who most of you probably know, was a Spanish artist who didn't achieve the fame that Picasso did, but they were close friends. And Gonzalez really was the one who inspired Picasso to try sculpture. So you're in really outstanding company here, Gordon, and I think you're holding your ground very well.
Well, copy the best, you know.
Yeah, that's right. That was the principle of academic teaching in the arts. You learn by copying the best, and then you find your own voice, which you've clearly done. So let's move on to the next piece. This is one of those pieces where I think your titles seem to be deliberately intended to at least give us a clue as to what inspired you, and then we can take it from there as we did with the previous piece. So flamenco, are you literally thinking of interpreting the flamenco dancing moves through the three-dimensional sculpture?
Again, I had, years ago with our daughter, we were in Seville in the summertime, and it was really hot. I mean, hot isn't and dry.
Yeah.
You just drink water constantly and wonder where it goes. And so in the one evening we went to what was a flamenco review, and it was just sort of a theater bar, and they were very, regular flamenco dancers, and they were very good. And I sort of remembered them somehow and tucked them in the back of my mind. And then when I began doing this series of volumes, you'll see later they're either kind of the open structures that we just saw, or these volumes which are closed, and the volumes have no internal structure whatsoever. They're just tin cans, so to speak. I was working here with applications of origami because sheet steel behaves very much like heavy cardboard or paper, pressed paper. And this was developed, the pattern was using either 3x5s or slightly larger cards that I would sit with a ballpoint pen and make creases and then fold it. So if you look on the view on the right, all of the edges that you see are not welded edges, they're folds. And
how thick is the sheet of metal that you're folding?
That's the catch. It generally, for something like this, it would be 20 gauge, perhaps 22 gauge, which
in
is
inches. What's that?
Well, a 16 gauge is a 16th of an inch.
Oh, okay.
So this is reduced from that, and
Yeah.
by the time you get to 24 gauge, it's flopping around almost like paper. So it's pretty thin.
Yeah. Well,
And
Gordon, to me, looking at this, it's just got so much energy and vitality. It's surprising until you explain the way you'd been thinking about origami, because it has that kind of delicacy and lightness that I wouldn't associate with metal. I would associate it more with something like paper. So are you consciously trying to sort of test the innate physical qualities of metal and what you can do with them and how far you can take them?
yeah, so I was here, as I'll explain when we get on further, that has to be abandoned. There are limits to what can be accomplished.
Yeah.
And this piece probably gets about as far as I'm willing to go.
Yeah.
You spend a lot of time trying to think up how to make the folds while preserving the shape that you know, like up near the top where the dress makes a shape for the dancer's breasts. That had to be very, very carefully incorporated to not affect the lower parts of her torso, and everything interacts with everything else. And if you get too carried away, it won't work.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you called that out and explained it in that way, because especially the image that's on our right, that to me, as soon as I saw it, I thought of the way in which the flamenco dancer can kick up her heel and take the skirt with it. And so it's really a wonderful, simplified essence of that swirling, dancing form. Quite beautiful.
So after I got going on this, there were other features that I wanted, but I always remembered when I was working in Detroit years ago, I went to the Detroit Institute of Art, and they had a wonderful piece by a very famous sculptor, Barlock, the Avenger, where the Avenger is wearing a cloak and has this enormous two-handed sword.
Yes.
And
yes.
And then I read up on Barlock, and he said, well, you can show action through the garment. And yo-ho, that was the solution right there.
Yeah.
So that's what you have here. It's a kind of a quote from Barlock, because his swordsman has a similar feature, but this is something flamenco dancers do all the time.
Yeah. Now I have one last question before we move on. You left the upper edge of this piece rough, and I think when I was looking at it, well, yes, I printed it out so I could look a little more closely. It looks almost like it's the jagged edge of the metal that you've used a torch to cut or to alter. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, if we had yet another view, you would see that I put a cap on it. There, you can't see into the volume.
That's where I was going. I wanted to know that.
I've often wondered if I would do it over again and just do the dress and not even bother to cap the thing off. But I decided to leave it rough, because flamenco has rough parts in it, aside from the tremendous angles and gestures. There are some things about it that are very gypsy-like.
Yes. Well, yes, it's based on a gypsy dance, the modern flamenco. So my last question then, I think will clarify, at least in my mind, when you do this, you are creating a form that encapsulates, at least somewhat, shapes space, not just form, but you're not trying to think about letting the interior be visible and let people know more about the gauge and the weight and the mass. It's more about the flow of line and shape.
That's right.
Yeah, so, well, it's beautifully done. But let's go on and enjoy some more of Gordon's work. So let's see the next piece. Now, this is where I'm just going to jump right in. The previous piece, even though highly abstract, very easily called to mind a female dancing. And this, of course, reminds me of people like Archipenko and other modernist sculptors who are streamlining the female form. Is the female form a major theme in your work, or is it just the selections that you chose for tonight's discussion?
No, I sort of like the graceful curves that one sees in the gestures that women do. I mean, if you have men versus women, men are kind of clunky and they may be stronger, but they're not as graceful. And so it's the gracefulness that is attractive, you know.
And do you work from a living model? Do you go to?
I do. Again, when COVID's not around, Montgomery College has Sunday drawing that goes on for 3 hours, and it's life drawing, and I have piles of those. But these particular works are not from a model. No.
Okay.
But
you've done the study. You've done the work. So you have the ideas about what you want to do. Why wood in this case instead of metal? And I think you do have that. Yeah, you have the small image is a metal.
That was the whole reason here is for showing this one. It's the pattern that matters. When I'm actually done with the design, I have patterns and I can do it in metal. You see the 30-inch version over there in the inset, or I can do it in wood by making up, gluing together some, in this case, it's fir, gluing up 4x4 blocks of fir and putting it on a bandsaw and sawing out parts and using a table sander, a disc sander, to shape the thing.
Well, Gordon, now the question comes to mind, more sort of mundane question, but you said your home has a garage where you do a lot of your metal work. Are you able to use all these materials and tools in your own garage, or do you have a studio somewhere where you can do that?
Well, hypothetically, I could. With the COVID thing, in my garage, my table belt sander is only a 4-inch one, and it works for smaller works. But a work like this would take a 6-inch one, and at Asbury, then we have a wood shop. We have a couple wood shops, but I go over to one of those and use theirs because you need a bigger piece of equipment. You also, for this, the size of this one, which is 18 inches high, I think it says, you need a bigger delta bandsaw with a deeper throat than mine in the garage is just for studies, something up to about 12 inches high.
Yeah. Well, you do keep them at a modest size, but there's still, there's always the question in sculpture, I think, for me and maybe for others, when you have these curves and you have these edges and you have these different surfaces, it's a tactile art. Do you intend your work to be these works are the size where somebody could hold them in their hands, or do you mean them to be seen and to be experienced only visually?
No, that's a very interesting question. This wood one here has been displayed quite a bit, and people come to me and say, you know, that thing is so beautiful. Can I touch it? And I said, go ahead. I mean, you know, I'm trying to remember what I did to finish it. I think it's shellac with wax on top of it. So it's hard to, the shellac gets pretty hard and the wax can always be redone. I mean, that's easy to do.
Yeah.
Now the
Well,
metal
that's good to
one,
know. And I think the grain, the way that you have thoughtfully combined these different pieces of wood and emphasize this nice grain in the piece, that's another thing that makes it more tactile. You know, the idea of that, the vein and the linearity that runs through the whole piece just seems to me to want to be touched.
she's like Miss Sunburn. That's what some people have said.
Oh yeah, the Sunbird.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a lovely piece, and so we're getting to explore some different materials that you utilize in your work. Let's look at the next slide. Yeah, this is the one I think I have to say, Gordon, I like the best. And you call it Spain, and why do you do that?
Again, this is, I just don't sit down to design a piece. The origin of this is, you see that little inset that says original mini pad drawing 2015?
Yeah.
Well, my wife and I had bought this mini pad, just a typical iPad. And my daughter had recommended that I get one of the sketch pieces of software on it.
Uh-huh.
And we were driving around up in northern Spain in the Basque region and et cetera, et cetera. Well, you know, some of the bus stages get a little tedious, you know, a couple hours on a bus. So I was sitting there just with my thumb on the screen in this drawing program. I did a fish. I have a fish I haven't executed yet. And we had just stopped in one place that had a museum of Inquisition torture instruments, which they had ghastly ways for you to leave this world.
Yeah.
But I was just kind of musing, and I twiddled some stuff. And it must have taken me all of 2 minutes to do that. And then went on to something else. But when we got home, I kind of liked that sketch.
Yeah.
And so then at a later time, I work in a open workshop down at the Cape Fritz Center in regular times on Friday. There's about a 5-hour open sculpture practicum, and they have all kinds of forming jigs and tools and stuff. And I did it down there rather quickly. The only tricky part is welding some of the rod pieces, doing butt end welds to put it together. But I have a TIG welder, which is very delicate. And so I finessed it by using my own welder.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of linear energy in this. And I think that's one of the real strengths of this piece, that even though you're working in such a dense material, rigid material like metal, you've got all of this fluid linearity in it. Where did you just sort of develop that on your own through experimentation, or was there some inspiration that suggested that as a path for you?
Well, you know, the stuff we saw on the folding of the steel and that is very controlled. And this is sort of a complement to that. I mean, sometimes you've just had enough of carefully folding and welding stuff, and you want to do something a little freer. And so that's what happens here. I just want to be let out of my cage. There's no other explanation for it than that.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, sure. Well, it's part of testing your materials in the art that you've chosen. But I was thinking a little more of, artistic inspiration. And when you said you were in the Basque region, I immediately thought of Joan Moreau. Even the red and yellow and black, that's sort of a palette that he often utilized as well.
Yeah, the red and yellow are the Spanish colors.
Yeah,
that's where
yeah.
I got them from.
Yeah,
and I just don't know. I mean, I've gone to the Murau Museum and seen all of his stuff. He's not one of my favorite artists, so I
really
didn't deliberately follow him. But you know, as we've talked before, this stuff goes into your head, and who knows how it comes out.
Yeah. Well, how about Calder? I'm wondering, this looks almost like it should be a Calder stabile.
It's probably Calder would be a good comparison. It by the way, you said stabile, but actually it jiggles.
Well,
the upper piece is the piece that goes out to the red tail and the styrofoam ball there is not fastened to the vertical bars of the lower section. So that whole wound up spring work is what it's on. And so it kind of sits there vibrating.
Oh, well, you know, that's really what he was doing with his stabile. Stabile simply means that there's a solid base for it, and the parts can move, or it can rotate around the base instead of being suspended. Well, that's great, though, that you found that on your own, through your own path, based on the experiences that you were having. I really think this is just it's got a lot of energy without being chaotic, you know, a lot of sort of pleasing rhythms to it. So if I ever had a Gordon Lyons, I think this one might be it. All right, let's move on.
So I've mentioned before that I'm interested, one of my principal motivations is exploring the continuum between realistic stuff, which I sometimes paint, like I'll paint portraits, all the way to abstract stuff, which might be, you know, so chaotic that you're at a loss to give any association as to what it is at all. And then there's kind of the middle stuff. So this, the sharp leafy part and that goes off to the left, the pointed leaf that points off to the upper left there, was a separate piece. And then the more rounded corner part is actually a quotation from a constructivist sculptor, Katarzyna Kobro, a Russian Polish gal. And this is her spatial construct number 9 of 1933. At the time when I did it, she wasn't very well known, but in subsequent years, she's picking up notoriety and more of a following, I think. And these two pieces, I had them separately, and I just happened to notice that I could drop one in on top of the other, and you get this really interesting thing. And then I began asking people what they thought it was. And of all the works I've done, I've had 33 different things that people associate this. They call it a swan landing, spilled milk, a harpist. You get the idea. It's all over the map.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of a famous early 20th century dancer, Loie Fuller.
Okay. A dancer of various types was also mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a famous video of her doing her dances, early film. You know, it's kind of grainy and stutters a little bit, but if you want to look her up on the internet, you'll find it very easily. And I think you'll see why I thought that. But I love the way that you've articulated what you were saying a moment ago about trying sort of how different pieces, even of your own, can go together, or how you can incorporate something that's inspired directly, or just in that way that we've been talking about, sort of subconsciously from things that you've seen in other works of art that have interested you. And that's a lesson that a lot of younger people don't seem to be comfortable with, that you can riff off another artist's work, and that's not stealing or copying or diminishing you, but rather it's showing your own creativity and how you're adapting something that you've seen or experienced. So I wish there were more of the younger generation with us tonight so that they could see what can happen with that kind of approach. So I think we only have one or two left.
One last comment here.
Yes.
Although most of this is either folded sheet metal or just plain cut out sheet metal, the welds were exceedingly touchy because you wanted the pieces to hold together, and yet everything, both sides of such welds sometimes showed. So you had to be very, very careful. It required an extremely delicate welding touch.
So technically you were able to do that with that delicate touch. You didn't have to sand or file or, do.
Oh, I filed it too, but
wow.
You couldn't do it with, well, I did the first one with a MIG welder, but then I did another version of this with a TIG welder, and believe me, the ability of a TIG welder to control the amount of metal that you introduce makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's so light, it's so delicate. It barely touches the ground, of course, or touches the base, but it just seems to almost float away into the air. So that's, considering it's metal, rather marvelous itself. All right, next slide, please. This seems to be the deliberate opposite. Is that why you've positioned them in this order?
Well, this is another one of my willingness to embrace art where I think I find it. We were on traveling in Japan. There's a type of around the inland sea of Japan, looking at various art places, and in the area of Ambe Prefecture, there's a type of ceramic art called beadsen. It's beautiful stuff, but it's craft-like. But they had a museum where they had contest winners, and it showed you what these craftsmen could do when they got away from what the marketplace demanded and just did what they wanted. And they had all kinds of interesting stuff. And I thought, I bet I could, maybe I should try that style in steel. So when you look at the other side of this, it has the characteristic asymmetry that you often find in Japanese design. You see how the center panel on this side points down, the apex points down?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, on the other side, it points up. And then when you try to put the pieces together, it comes out not quite square in the bottom. You can tell the way on the left it folds, the side folds away. So it has a typical sort of austere, asymmetric, vase-like shape that's vaguely Japanese.
Yes.
And then I mixed some of my own paint using my own medium so I could get it to run nicely the way I wanted. And I sort of did that because in the beats and the pottery, they use straw patterns and hair and whatever when they fire it to get the pattern. I didn't have that option. So I just used paint and let gravity do its work.
Yeah. I'm wondering about the rest of the surface that's unpainted, because it does seem to vary in its hue and maybe even somewhat in its texture. Was that deliberate? What we're looking at was the finish that you deliberately created?
Yeah, it's polished steel. I originally tried one other type of finish, but it ran, so I had to take the finish all off and buff it, and then it started showing other sorts of buffing patterns, and I thought that's fine.
Yeah, yeah.
And so then this is essentially covered with the finish on it is linseed oil with an alkaline accelerator so that it'll dry faster.
Uh-huh.
And it has like 5 coats on it. So that gives it a little depth.
Yeah, it does. And it gives a variation, it looks like, too, in terms of the darkness or light. Well, is this literally a vase that can be used as a vase?
No, it's only for dried flowers only. Because I only tack welded the bottom to it.
Oh, so it'll leak?
It'll leak.
Yeah. Well, it's a beautiful form, and it's another example of your work, I think. I usually don't feel this strong an attraction, but this is something too. It's the right size, put it in your hands and explore it a little bit. Let's see, I think we have another wooden head this time, and then an open torso. Well, while you're pulling it up, the reason I want to talk about it is because not only do I love the abstract torso and the colors and the lines, but Gordon, it's almost like you're channeling and reinterpreting some of the driving forces of early modernism in Europe and America. I mean, you really have a handle on it. You're not fumbling around sort of trying to find your way. You seem to have found it, but it's based on these kinds of artistic ideas. Well, I can say that.
I've often joked to friends that if this were 100 years ago, I'd fit right in Paris,
You sure would. Absolutely.
But it's too late. The bus has left a long time ago.
Well, only in the sense that the art market is driven by, what's the newest and the most unusual that somebody can manage to do. But you want to just, we'll wrap up then by talking about this. Sure. Because you are a painter and a draftsman and do very fine work in that respect. So you want to just share a little bit about this piece?
Okay, this has various titles. My current working title for it is Shorebird.
Yeah.
And it arose because I was testing out a ballpoint pen and I did some squiggles on paper, and one of the swiggle sets, I looked at it and I said, well, I can make something out of that. And so this is where my modern technique comes in. I put it on a scanner and then I blew it up, and then I moved it over to Photoshop Express and began working on it and developing it. And then I went through, Will, I think you and I discussed, I tried some triad colors.
Yes.
I always start with Brock with his orange, green, violet. Mm-hmm. But of course, with Photoshop, you can make substitutions of colors. And so I probably have gone through 20 variations, trying this and that and whatever. And in the end, this is what I came up with. And it's, other than a few squiggly lines, it's all been done electronically. And this is the work.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
Well-
I actually have painted it. I could reach around and show you the painting, which is sitting behind me here. But it is not quite the subtlety that's shown in the electronic version, which shows you that modern electronic methods have something to say for them. It goes very fast, by the way.
Well, Gordon, that's a wonderful point to end our conversation on, because you have been working primarily as an artist for over 2 decades. You're of an older generation, and you are harking back in some respects to the fundamentally motivating ideas of early modernism, but yet here you are working in the latest electronic arena and doing very original and creative work with that. So it's kind of a very nice and impressive arc to your career. And I'm really glad you allowed us to take the time to get to know you and your work a little more tonight. Now, we've got 10 whole minutes for questions, if there are any. So fire away. Gordon, you talked about a couple of different welding techniques. Could you briefly explain the difference between them? I'm not familiar with the distinctions.
Oh, yeah. Everybody's probably familiar with the oxyacetylene welding, where you have a little torch and you dab. One hand you have a steel rod that you hold like this. The other hand you have your flame, and you get a little puddle and you dab and you kind of drag it along, and that forms the joint. Well, during World War II, they developed a technique that has a gun that I don't know if you can see it clear. It looks like this ballpoint pen. There's an outer sheath, and then there's a wire that comes out, and there's a mechanism that keeps extruding this thin wire. And so all you have to do is hold this thing, and there's a spark that jumps from the wire to the metal you're welding. And so it's like a big glue gun. And that's called metal in gas, the MIG welding. And it goes very fast. They liked it for assembling ships, for instance, in World War II.
Mhm.
Now the gun is probably, the diameter of it is 3/4 of an inch rather than my pen, so it would be more like that. So it's a little clumsier. That works very fine when you're doing outside welds and you have a lot to do, like you're doing furniture or something like that. The other method I have is called tungsten in gas. And with tungsten in gas, you have the same sort of mechanism, but instead of a wire that's extruded, that's a tungsten rod, and the gas comes down the tube and flows around the rod. And then in your other hand, you have the steel rod that you want to fill, and you use one to heat it up, much like you would an oxyacetylene if this were a torch here. And the other one, you have to dab in it and keep moving it along. It's very slow, but you can do jewelry with it.
Wow.
Jewelry for your hand, a tiny little thing, but it's steel and it's strong as can be.
Wow.
It's expensive because it uses a lot of gas. Well, you're not going very fast.
Yeah. Well, at least you're not working on gigantic scale.
No. There's something my scale gives out at about 5 feet. That's about. I don't feel compelled to do anything larger than that.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions from the audience?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Do you would happen to know when or his work going to be displayed in the gallery, so I can go and see in person?
The MFA doesn't really have one-person shows. We have some off-site locations, a couple of restaurants in town. Gordon would have to ask to be included in that program, which I certainly encourage him to do. But the more immediate potential is if Gordon continues to enter in our member shows or our all-comers shows, then he would have individual works in the shows at the Circle Gallery or our own online Curve Gallery. Gordon, do you have any upcoming shows anyplace else that you can share with the listener?
Well, the vase piece that I showed is currently on display at the Cumberland Valley Artists competition up in the Washington County Museum of Fine Art, a real gem of a little museum up in Hagerstown.
Yes.
So that will run through April, I think April 24th or something like that. Also, if you go to the Delaplane, I had a show, a solo show there last year, and they made a video display of it. I don't know if you can still pull it off their site or not, but it sort of panned around I had the whole, it showed every work in that, but 10 pieces in that, and they were pretty much what you've seen here about that scale, you know.
Gordon, why don't you share your website address and then we'll move on if there are any other questions.
Oh yeah, you can see some of the other works at, just run it all together, GordonLyonArt.com.
Great. Yeah, I looked at that yesterday and again today. Very interesting, Tanya, because Gordon does a lot of drawing and painting that we haven't talked about, and I think you'd enjoy seeing those. So any other questions before I have to run?
But I do want to mention, Gordon, it's really exciting for me to see how much experimentation you do in your works. And it seems like you always have a lot of fun with each piece that you do. So I really look forward to seeing more of your work in the future.
Well, thank you very much. I've always said, even when I was working in computer science, that almost everything can be turned into an experiment, and I sort of carried that along. There's a lot of similarities between science and art, you know.
Yeah.
Well, and they both can be exciting.
Gordon, thanks again for sharing your time and your work and your thoughts with us. And Marissa, that was a very insightful comment, and I appreciate your support. And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. It'll be about 2 weeks. And then, of course, this will be available through a link on our website, and you can re-watch it or share it with others. So, well, good night, and thanks for everyone's participation tonight.
Thank you so much, everyone. You all have a good night. And thank you to Gordon and Wil. Bye.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Gordon.